What if one ordinary flight became the moment your dignity was stripped away? Picture yourself sitting in the seat you earned, looking forward to a quiet journey. Then, without warning, you're told to leave treated as if you don't belong, while others watch in silence. That's what happened to Clara Johnson, the proud mother of a black CEO, when Aurora Airways staff removed her from first class in front of everyone. Now, imagine, would you have swallowed the humiliation to avoid conflict? Or would you have held your ground, no matter the cost? And if you were her son, David Johnson, the CEO of the very airline where this unfolded, would you protect the company's image, or risk everything to defend your mother's dignity? This is not just about a seat on a plane. It's about a question each of us must answer when respect is denied. Will we stay silent, or will we choose to stand tall? Clara's choice didn't just defend herself. It shook an entire industry. If this story stirs something in you, please like, share, and subscribe so more people can reflect on it. The air inside Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, rolling suitcases clattering against the polished floor, boarding announcements echoing overhead, and hurried footsteps rushing past. In the middle of all that noise, Clara Johnson walked slowly, each step steady, deliberate, almost serene. She was dressed simply. A faded wool cardigan hugged her shoulders, the kind of cardigan that had been mended more than once but carried the warmth of years. Her slacks were modest, slightly worn at the hems. In her hand she carried a small leather-bound Bible, its edges frayed, pages yellowed by time and love. Around her wrist, a silver bracelet glimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights, her late husband's gift, worn every single day since he passed. Clara didn't look like the kind of passenger who usually drifted toward the first-class gate. She knew that. She had lived long enough to recognize the silent language of wealth, of status, of privilege. But this morning she had chosen not to hide, not to step back into the shadows of modesty. She had chosen to board Aurora Airways Flight 227 from Chicago to Washington, D.C., in the seat her son had purchased for her first class, Seat 3A. Her heart beat slowly but firmly as she approached the gate. People glanced up from their phones. Some eyes lingered longer than others, curiosity flickering like a match. A woman in a tailored blazer clutched her designer bag closer. A man in an expensive suit looked once at Clara, then away, as though embarrassed by his own thought. The boarding announcement rang out clearly: Aurora Airways Flight 227 to Washington, D.C. We now invite our first-class passengers to board. Clara inhaled deeply, the way she often did before speaking to her students in her years as a schoolteacher. With a soft smile, she stepped forward, ticket in hand. The gate agent scanned her pass without hesitation and nodded politely. No one here knew she was the mother of David Johnson, the powerful black CEO of Aurora Airways, and Clara preferred it that way. She didn't need status to justify her place. She had lived her whole life without it. But the moment she walked down the jet bridge, she could already sense what was coming. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed with muted luxury cream-colored leather seats, polished wood paneling, a faint trace of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Clara paused to read her ticket again. Seat 3A. She found it easily, tucked near the window, and placed her small bag beneath the seat in front of her. She touched the armrest gently, as if reassuring herself that she belonged there. That was when she felt it. The weight of eyes. Margaret, the lead flight attendant, stood near the galley. She was tall, her uniform pressed to perfection, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly that her expression seemed permanently sharp. Her gaze landed on Clara, and for a split second it softened into confusion. Then it hardened again into something else, skepticism, suspicion. Behind her, Brian, another attendant, whispered low enough that most passengers wouldn't hear. But Clara did. "Are you sure she's supposed to be here?" Margaret tilted her head just slightly, lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll check," she murmured back. A younger attendant named Sophie stood nearby, her posture uncertain. She glanced at Clara, then back at her colleagues. Her face revealed hesitation, the kind of unease that comes from knowing something is wrong but lacking the courage to stop it. Clara opened her Bible quietly, turning to a well-worn psalm. She had taught herself over the years to seek calm in words, to let Scripture soften the blows of the world. Yet she could not ignore the laughter quiet, muffled from Brian as he continued whispering with Margaret. From the corner of her eye, Clara noticed a businessman across the aisle shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He knew what was happening. Others did, too. But silence is a powerful accomplice. No one spoke. Clara's heart tightened. She had faced looks like these before in grocery stores, at banks, even in the quiet pews of church. Looks that said you don't belong here. She was used to swallowing the sting, to carrying it quietly, but something about this cabin felt heavier. It wasn't just the first-class luxury. It was the certainty with which people believed she was out of place. Her fingers pressed against the bracelet on her wrist. She thought of her husband, gone now, but still the anchor of her strength. She thought of David, her son, who had risen from those same whispered doubts and locked doors to become one of the most powerful men in American business. He had bought her this ticket because he believed she deserved it, because he believed she belonged anywhere. But the staff in front of her did not see that truth. They only saw an elderly black woman in worn clothes. Brian walked toward her now, his smile practiced, polished, but hollow. "Ma'am," he said softly, though his tone dripped with condescension, "could I see your boarding pass again, just to make sure everything is in order?" Clara lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze. She had learned long ago not to let people strip away her dignity without a fight. She held up the ticket calmly. "This is my seat, 3A. Brian studied the ticket longer than necessary, frowning faintly, as though searching for an error that wasn't there. "Are you sure there hasn't been some kind of upgrade mistake?" Clara's chest rose with a slow breath. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him, out the window, at the tarmac glistening under the early morning sun. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but unshakable. "There's no mistake. I belong here." Her words hung in the air, heavy enough to silence Brian for a moment. But across the aisle, Margaret's cold voice cut through. "Let's verify with her ID as well, just to be safe." The businessman shifted again. Sophie bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable, yet no one spoke for Clara. Clara closed her Bible and folded her hands in her lap. Her heart was steady, her spirit calm. But inside, an old familiar ache returned. She knew this flight would not be the peaceful journey she had hoped for. Something was building, something she had endured before but would not escape today. As she pressed her palm against the silver bracelet, Clara whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "They don't know who I am, but they will." The cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers, the clinking of glasses, the faint rattle of overhead bins closing. But beneath it all, an invisible storm was already brewing, one that would shake not only this flight, but the entire foundation of Aurora Airways. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the window as the boarding process continued. One passenger after another entered the cabin, each carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of those accustomed to luxury. The sounds of polite greetings, rolling luggage wheels, and the click of expensive shoes against the floor blended into a rhythm she had never been part of before. Yet she sat silently, her hands folded over her Bible, a small island of calm in a sea of scrutiny. The attendant's whispers were not lost on her. She had learned long ago how to pick words out of the hum of conversation, especially when those words carried weight against her. Margaret's voice was crisp, like the snap of ice. Brian's was mocking, tinged with disbelief. Sophie's was the softest, the kind that held back rather than struck directly, but silence could cut too. Clara had lived through decades of silences like that. Her mind slipped back to another time, another place. She was in her early 20s, newly married, standing with her husband at the counter of a bank in Alabama. They had gone to open their first joint account, their hands clasped with nervous excitement. The banker had smiled politely, but his eyes flicked over them with the same question that Margaret's held now. "Do you really belong here?" It was the same look that had followed her when she applied for teaching jobs, when she tried to rent an apartment, even when she walked into certain grocery stores. Always that question, always that doubt. Clara had carried those memories like stones in her pockets heavy, but never enough to sink her spirit. And today, as she sat in seat 3A of Aurora Airways, she felt the same stone pressing down again. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, remembering her husband's words on the day he gave it to her. "This is a reminder. No matter where you go, you carry dignity with you. They can't take that away." A tall man in a navy suit brushed past her seat, pausing to place his briefcase overhead. He glanced at Clara quickly, his brow furrowed, then turned away. Another woman, draped in jewelry that sparkled under the cabin lights, gave Clara a slow once-over before settling into her seat with a faint smirk. These gestures weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to pierce. Margaret walked by again, her clipboard in hand. Her heels clicked decisively on the floor. She stopped briefly near Clara's seat, her smile thin, professional, but distant. "We'll be departing shortly," she said to no one in particular, but her gaze lingered on Clara longer than necessary. Clara nodded once, calm and steady. Inside, though, she felt a storm gathering. She had promised herself she wouldn't shrink. Not this time. Not in front of them. Sophie approached timidly, carrying a tray of pre-flight drinks. "Would you like some water?" "Ma'am," she asked. Her voice was soft, and for the first time, Clara felt a hint of genuine kindness. She accepted the glass with a small smile. "Thank you, dear," Clara said gently. Sophie hesitated as if she wanted to say something more. But then Margaret called her name sharply from the galley, and the moment passed. Sophie retreated quickly, her shoulders tight with tension. The intercom crackled, announcing final boarding. Clara's eyes drifted shut briefly, her thoughts moving to her son. David had insisted on buying her the first-class ticket. "Mom, you deserve this. You've worked your whole life and sacrificed so much. Let me give you this one thing." She had resisted at first, but he wouldn't hear it. She remembered the pride in his eyes, the way he had hugged her at the airport drop-off. "Text me when you land," he had said firmly, like the protective son he had always been. Clara smiled faintly at the memory, though it tightened with worry. David didn't know how the world could still treat someone like her. Not fully. He had climbed so high that people bowed in his presence, forgetting, or maybe never knowing, the barriers he had broken to get there. Clara thought of him as a boy, sitting at the kitchen table with books spread out, determined to learn, determined to rise. She had stayed up with him through countless nights, quizzing him on history, correcting his math, encouraging him when the weight of being different threatened to crush him. She had told him again and again, "You are enough. You are worthy." He had carried those words into every room he entered, every board meeting, every headline, and now here she sat, carrying them too. But even as her heart swelled with pride for her son, her chest tightened with a question. What will he do if he learns about this? She knew his temper, his sense of justice. He would not stay silent, but sometimes silence, painful as it was, protected peace. She wasn't sure which choice was right anymore. The boarding door closed with a final thud. The engines hummed alive, a steady vibration flowing beneath her feet. Passengers settled into their seats, buckling belts, adjusting headrests. Clara exhaled slowly, steadying herself for the hours ahead. Margaret returned once more, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the cabin. She stopped at Clara's row again. "Ma'am," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "May I see your ticket one more time? We've had some seating irregularities." Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the Bible in her lap. She lifted the boarding pass again without hesitation. "It says 3A. That's me." Margaret examined it with a faint frown, then returned it with a curt nod. But she didn't walk away. "Just so you know," she added in a voice meant to carry beyond Clara's seat. "First class is reserved for our premium guests. We want to make sure all passengers are comfortable." The businessman across the aisle shifted again, clearly uneasy. A murmur rippled faintly through the rows. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she held Margaret's gaze with quiet defiance. "I am comfortable," she replied softly, yet firmly. "Are you for a moment?" Silence blanketed the space. Margaret blinked, her composure faltering just slightly, before she straightened again and walked away. Brian smirked as he followed behind her. Sophie kept her head down. Clara turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Wrinkles lined her face, carved by years of endurance, but her eyes still burned with life. She touched the bracelet again, whispering under her breath, "I belong here, no matter what they say." The engines roared louder as the plane prepared for takeoff. Around her, conversations rose and fell. Laughter trickled from one corner, and champagne glasses clinked. But inside Clara's heart, the storm pressed harder. Each glance, each whispered doubt piling onto her spirit. She prayed silently for strength not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the plane lifted into the sky, Clara closed her eyes, holding on to that prayer. She did not yet know how this flight would end, but she knew one thing with certainty. This was not just another journey. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would reach far beyond seat 3A, beyond the cabin, beyond even Aurora Airways itself. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed to a soft golden glow. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, a kind of lullaby for those used to comfort. Yet, for Clara Johnson, there was no comfort. Her body rested against the plush leather of seat 3A, but her spirit braced itself as if standing against a storm. Margaret reappeared from the galley, her heels clicking in sharp beats against the aisle. With her came the quiet authority of someone who believed she was the keeper of the order in this small kingdom called first class. She glanced down the rows, her eyes narrowing as they landed once again on Clara. Brian trailed behind her, carrying a tray of warm towels. His smirk hadn't faded since boarding. Sophie followed last, her steps hesitant, her face pale as if she were carrying a secret she was afraid to tell. Margaret stopped at the row ahead of Clara, offering towels to a couple dressed in sleek business attire. Her smile there was easy, practiced, almost warm. Then she turned, stepping to Clara's seat with the same gesture, but her tone hardened. "Towel, ma'am," she asked. Though it came out more like an accusation than an offer, Clara accepted it with grace, nodding politely. "Thank you." Margaret's gaze flicked to the Bible resting on Clara's lap, then to the cardigan with its worn elbows. Something in her eyes sharpened, as if confirming a judgment she had already made. She turned briskly to Brian. "Double-check her ticket again," she murmured under her breath, but not quiet enough. Brian leaned closer to Clara, his voice low but edged with mockery. "Ma'am, we just want to make sure everything's correct. Sometimes mistakes happen." Clara's hands tightened around the towel. She had already shown her ticket twice, but she reached calmly into her small handbag, pulled it out again, and handed it over. Her dignity remained intact, though her patience strained. Brian examined the slip with exaggerated care, as if searching for invisible flaws. Finally, he handed it back. "All right," he muttered, but the smirk remained. The passengers around them noticed. A woman across the aisle glanced over her magazine, lips pressed together but silent. A man further down adjusted his tie and looked out the window, as though distance might absolve him of involvement. Silence, always silence, wrapped around Clara like a second skin, as painful as the words themselves. Sophie lingered a moment longer, her eyes darting between Clara and her colleagues. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, but then Margaret's sharp voice cut across the aisle. "Sophie, the champagne." The young attendant closed her mouth quickly, turned, and obeyed. Clara saw the conflict in her eyes, but conflict without courage was still surrender. Clara leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. She thought of David again, her son who had built entire empires with resilience sharper than steel. What would he say if he saw her now? He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, for his mother to be humiliated this way. She imagined the fury in his voice, the way he would demand accountability, but she wasn't sure if she wanted him to know. Not yet. The drink service began. Crystal glasses clinked as Sophie handed them out, her smile thin but kind. Margaret and Brian moved swiftly through the rows, serving passengers with polished efficiency. When they reached Clara's row, Brian paused, holding the bottle of champagne with deliberate hesitation. He looked her over once, then asked with mock courtesy, "Would you prefer water instead?" The question struck the air like a slap. Clara felt her cheeks warm, but she lifted her chin. "Champagne will be fine," she said softly. Brian poured the glass, his smirk widening as if daring her to spill her dignity. He placed it on her tray table with unnecessary force, the crystal clinking sharply. Margaret gave a brief nod, approving his action without words, before moving on. Clara lifted the glass slowly, her hands steadied despite the tremor she felt inside. She took a small sip, tasting not the luxury of the drink but the bitterness of being singled out. Her thoughts drifted back to the classrooms where she had once taught. She remembered the wide eyes of children who looked to her not just for knowledge, but for protection. She had told them again and again, "You are worth more than they say. Never let the world convince you otherwise." And yet here she was, years later, forced to remind herself of those same words. Sophie returned quietly to clear trays. When she leaned toward Clara, her voice dropped to a whisper. I'm sorry," she said quickly, her eyes darting to Margaret. "This isn't right." Clara met her gaze with a small, knowing smile. "It rarely is," she whispered back. Sophie hesitated, then nodded slightly before hurrying away. The cabin settled into a hushed rhythm. Passengers reclined, some dozed, some worked on laptops. Margaret disappeared into the galley with Brian, their voices low but edged with laughter. Clara closed her eyes briefly, letting the vibration of the engine steady her, but then came the announcement. Margaret's voice rang out from the intercom, clear and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We'll be experiencing some mild turbulence." Clara buckled her belt calmly. The plane shuddered gently as it cut through a patch of unstable air. The lights flickered for a moment, then steadied. When Margaret and Brian returned to check the cabin, Margaret stopped once more at Clara's row. She bent down slightly, her voice soft but cutting. "Ma'am, just so you understand, first class is designed for passengers who match a certain expectation. If there's been a mistake, we need to correct it before landing." The words burned deeper than any turbulence. Clara's lips parted, but she held them closed. She would not give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Instead, she looked her straight in the eye and said quietly, "The only mistake is assuming I don't belong." For a moment, Margaret's composure cracked. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes narrowed. Then she straightened, gave a curt nod, and walked away. The tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers shifted, whispering quietly, yet still no one intervened. Clara felt the silence more than the insults. Silence was consent, and it stung worse than any spoken word. She leaned back once more, pressing her palm against her bracelet. The storm inside her swirled heavier now, a mix of sorrow, anger, and resolve. She whispered under her breath, barely audible even to herself, "Hold steady. The truth always rises." Outside, the sky stretched endless and blue. Inside, the walls of first class closed in like a cage. Clara's journey was no longer just about reaching Washington, D.C. It was about surviving this silent battlefield where dignity itself was on trial. The hours in the air stretched on, and though the hum of the engines never changed, the atmosphere in first class had grown heavier. Clara Johnson sat still in seat 3A, her eyes calm but her spirit restless. She had been stared at, questioned, whispered about, but she had not been moved. Still, she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down like an invisible hand against her chest. Margaret returned from the galley with a clipboard in hand. Her lips pursed as though she carried out a mission of grave importance. She stopped at Clara's row once again, her presence towering like a shadow. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cool, "I'll need to see a photo ID this time. Just procedure." Clara lifted her chin slowly. "You've seen my boarding pass 3 times already," she answered. Her voice was soft, but each word carried a firmness that Margaret did not expect. "Boarding passes can be misprinted," Margaret countered, her eyes sharp. "We need to ensure everything is in order. First class is selective." Brian leaned casually against the seat across the aisle, his grin careless and mocking. "Don't take it the wrong way, ma'am. We just like to keep things consistent." His tone made it clear he wasn't talking about seating arrangements. The words hung in the air like smoke. Passengers shifted in their seats. One man cleared his throat as if he might speak, but then he pressed his lips shut, retreating into silence. Sophie stood a few feet away, her tray held tightly, her knuckles white. She looked as though she might step forward, but her body froze under Margaret's authority. Clara reached calmly into her bag and pulled out her wallet. She slid her driver's license free and held it out. Her hand did not shake. Margaret took it, studying the photo longer than necessary, as if searching for proof of her doubt. Finally, she handed it back with a curt nod. "Thank you," she said, but there was no gratitude in her tone, only the cold triumph of someone who thought they had established control. Clara slipped the ID back into her wallet, her face serene. Inside, though, memories churned years of being questioned, of being treated as less, of being told subtly and openly that she did not belong. She thought of the grocery line where the cashier checked her bills twice. She thought of the hotel lobby where the receptionist assumed she was a maid instead of a guest. Now, here, in the supposed luxury of first class, she faced it again. The tension did not end there. When the meal service began, Margaret and Brian moved down the aisle with trays of plated salmon and roasted vegetables. Passengers around Clara were served swiftly, their plates set with care, their glasses refilled with wine. When they reached Clara's row, Brian paused, holding a smaller tray. On it sat a cold sandwich wrapped in plastic. "This is what we have left," he said smoothly, though Clara could see the untouched trays in the galley behind him. His smile was a mask, but the intent behind it was clear. A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. Clara lifted her eyes to his. For a moment, the two locked stares, his filled with condescension, hers with quiet fire. She placed her hands gently on her lap and spoke with calm clarity. "That is not what I ordered. My son booked this seat with a first-class meal." Brian's smirk twitched. "Sometimes orders don't carry through the system." Margaret's voice cut in, sharp and final. "If she doesn't want it, she doesn't have to eat." Sophie's face flushed. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but Margaret shot her a glance so cold that she closed it again. Clara looked at the sandwich for a long moment, then back at Brian. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the tray back toward him. "I will not be shamed into accepting less than what I deserve," she said softly. Her voice did not waver, though her heart ached with the weight of every eye upon her. The businessman across the aisle finally shifted, clearing his throat. "She's right," he muttered. "This doesn't seem fair." But his voice was low, hesitant, barely audible, as though afraid of making himself part of the storm. No one else spoke. Margaret straightened, her smile tight. "We'll resolve this after landing," she said firmly, before moving on. The silence that followed was worse than any insult. Clara sat with her hands folded, her dignity intact, but her body heavy with the sting of humiliation. She could feel the heat of judgment pressing from all sides, not only from the crew, but from the passengers who chose their silence over justice. She had told herself to be calm, to endure, but even she could not deny that something inside her cracked in that moment. She thought again of David. She pictured his face when he heard of this, the way his jaw would tighten, the way his voice would thunder against injustice. She thought of calling him right then, telling him everything, but her fingers hesitated. Would she burden him with this pain, or would she let it pass, as she had let so many other slights pass before her hand brushed against her bracelet? Her husband's words echoed in her mind. Dignity is not given, it is lived. She drew strength from it, though her throat tightened. Margaret and Brian retreated to the galley, their voices low but their laughter audible. Clara closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer under her breath. She prayed for strength, she prayed for clarity, and deep within, though she didn't want to admit it yet, she prayed for justice. The plane rocked gently as it cut through another patch of air. The passengers shifted in their seats, some pulling blankets closer, others adjusting their screens. But Clara remained still, her eyes now open, her gaze steady. She knew this flight would not end in silence, whether she spoke or not, whether David became involved or not. Something was set into motion the moment Margaret demanded her ID and Brian placed that sandwich on her tray. The storm had broken, and it would not pass quietly. The steady rhythm of the engines could not quiet the tension that had thickened in the cabin. Clara Johnson sat straight in her seat, her hands folded over her lap, her Bible resting like a shield of memory and faith. The cold sandwich still sat untouched on her tray table, its plastic wrap glinting beneath the cabin lights like a badge of shame. She would not touch it. She would not allow them that satisfaction. Margaret returned after a while, her presence carrying the authority of someone who believed her decisions were beyond question. She paused at Clara's row again, her eyes sharp, her smile brittle. "Ma'am," she said in a tone loud enough for several rows to hear, "if you cannot comply with the standards of this cabin, we may need to reassign your seat for the remainder of the flight." The words struck the air like a gavel. Passengers turned their heads now, no longer pretending to ignore the tension. Some frowned with discomfort, others looked away quickly, and a few whispered softly to one another. Clara felt every eye, every silence pressing into her, demanding she shrink, but she refused. She lifted her gaze slowly, her voice calm though her heart trembled. "I am sitting in the seat my son purchased. I have complied with every request you have made. The only standard I refuse to accept is being treated as less than anyone else here." Margaret's jaw tightened. "We need to ensure all our premium passengers feel comfortable." Her eyes flicked briefly to the businessman across the aisle, who shifted in his seat but said nothing more. Brian stepped forward, his smirk gone, replaced by a sharper edge. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in economy?" "Ma'am, we have open seats there. That way, no one has to feel uneasy." The words were plain, unvarnished. They hung heavy in the air, undeniable in their meaning. Clara inhaled slowly, her chest rising, her spirit bracing against the blow. She had been pushed aside before in her life, asked to move, to step down, to give way, always politely, always under the guise of comfort. She had accepted it in the past to avoid conflict, but not now. She placed her hand firmly on the armrest, her fingers curling around it like a claim. "This is my seat," she said softly but firmly. "I will not move." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie, standing a few feet away, looked stricken. Her lips parted as if to speak, but again fear pinned her voice down. She glanced at Margaret, then back at Clara, her eyes shimmering with something close to shame. Margaret straightened, her face cold. She tapped her pen against the clipboard in her hand and said, "Very well, we'll have security meet us when we land." She turned sharply on her heel, her heels clicking like the closing of a cell door. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder now. Some exchanged glances of discomfort. Others leaned closer to whisper to their companions. Yet not one stood. Not one raised a voice. Clara felt the sting of that silence more than Margaret's words. She pressed her palm against the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one her husband had given her, and whispered inwardly for strength. The minutes dragged into hours, each one heavier than the last. The turbulence outside had passed, but the storm within the cabin had only grown. Brian returned occasionally, refilling glasses with wine, offering plates of fruit and dessert to other passengers, each gesture punctuated by the deliberate absence of service to Clara. The tray table before her remained bare, but for the unwanted sandwich, its cold presence a reminder of her exclusion. Finally, as the plane began its slow descent toward Washington, D.C., Margaret appeared once more. This time, She did not bother with smiles or clipped politeness. Her tone was curt, final. "Ma'am, I'll need you to gather your belongings. Upon arrival, you'll be escorted off the plane for further verification." Gasps rose from a few passengers. The businessman across the aisle shifted again, his face tight with discomfort. At last, he spoke, though his words wavered. "Is that really necessary? She hasn't done anything wrong." Margaret's eyes flicked to him briefly, cool and dismissive. "Sir, we're following procedure, for the safety and comfort of all passengers." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her bag, not with fear, but with the heaviness of humiliation. She felt the stares drilling into her back, the whispers swirling like smoke. She rose slowly, her movements measured, her dignity intact even as the weight of the moment threatened to crush her. As she stepped into the aisle, Brian gestured impatiently toward the rear of the plane. Sophie lowered her eyes, tears glistening as she busied herself with collecting trays. No one else spoke, no one else moved. Clara walked down the aisle, each step echoing like a drumbeat of injustice. She could feel her body trembling, but her spirit stood tall. At the edge of her mind, a voice whispered her husband's, her own, her son's, "You belong. Hold steady." When she reached the curtain separating first class from economy, she paused briefly. She turned her head, her eyes sweeping the silent faces around her. With a voice low but strong, she said, "Remember this moment. Remember the silence." Then she pulled the curtain aside and stepped through. The hush that followed was thick and suffocating. The passengers remained in their seats, bound by the invisible chains of comfort and fear. Margaret and Brian exchanged satisfied glances. Sophie pressed her lips together, her chest rising and falling quickly as though she were holding back sobs. In the economy cabin, Clara found an empty seat near the back. The chair was narrower, the armrest scuffed, the window streaked with fingerprints, but as she settled into it, she felt strangely lighter. The humiliation had been heavy, but it had also clarified something deep inside her. She had endured. She had stood firm, and though the cabin above still buzzed with quiet judgment, her dignity had not been surrendered. She gazed out the window as the city lights of Washington, D.C. began to sparkle beneath the descending plane. Her fingers pressed once more against her bracelet, and she whispered softly, "David, my son, you will know, and when you do, justice will follow." The landing was smooth, but Clara Johnson's spirit carried turbulence that no calm descent could erase. The wheels touched down on the runway with a soft screech, and the familiar announcement echoed through the speakers. "Welcome to Washington, D.C. Local time is 6:45 p.m. For most passengers, the words meant relief, the end of a long journey. For Clara, they carried the weight of humiliation that had been forced upon her in the skies. She remained seated as the plane taxied to the gate, her eyes fixed on the lights shimmering outside. Passengers around her unclipped their belts, stretched their arms, and reached for bags in the overhead bins. The chatter grew louder, a crescendo of plans, meetings, and dinners awaiting them in the capital. Clara heard every word, but none of it touched her. She was still standing at the invisible line that Margaret and Brian had drawn, still hearing the silence of strangers who had witnessed her humiliation and said nothing. The flight attendants busied themselves for arrival. Margaret's voice rang out again, polished and professional, as if nothing had happened. "We'll be arriving at the gate shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." Brian chuckled at something she whispered, his tone light, casual, unbothered. Sophie, however, moved stiffly, her eyes downcast, her hands fumbling slightly as she gathered items from the galley. Clara closed her eyes briefly. She prayed for calm, not for herself alone, but for the strength to face what came next. She knew this story was not over. She had been humiliated publicly, forced from the seat her son had given her, and now she carried the decision of whether to remain silent or to speak. Silence had been her shield many times before, but this time it felt heavier, more dangerous. When the seatbelt sign finally clicked off, passengers surged forward, reaching for their bags. Clara waited, unhurried. She did not want to be swept into their rush. She gathered her bag slowly, slid her Bible inside, and rose from the narrow seat in economy. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and recycled air, but she carried herself with dignity, her back straight, her steps measured. As she entered the jet bridge, she felt eyes on her again, passengers glancing back, attendants whispering quietly behind her. She ignored them. The humiliation still burned, but she would not allow them the victory of seeing her crumble. In the terminal, she found a quiet bench near the windows and sat down. The airport buzzed around her, families reuniting, business travelers rushing, announcements echoing overhead. Clara placed her hands in her lap and stared at the bracelet on her wrist, the silver glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. She thought of her husband again, of his unyielding belief in dignity, of his reminder that no one could strip her worth. Yet even with his memory close, the ache in her chest remained. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from David Landed yet. "Mom, how was the flight?" Clara stared at the words, her heart tightening. She could respond with the simple answer he expected. Yes, landed safely, and bury the truth. She had done it before, hiding wounds to protect him, to protect herself from reliving the pain. But as her thumb hovered over the keyboard, she felt the crack widening inside her. This silence, if she chose it again, would not only be her burden, it would become her son's too. Her fingers trembled as she typed, "I landed. I need to tell you something important." Moments later, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. David's voice filled her ear, deep and steady, though tinged with worry. "Mom, what's wrong?" Clara's throat tightened. She drew in a breath, steadying herself. The flight wasn't what you hoped it would be. "What do you mean?" His tone sharpened instantly. She hesitated, glancing around the busy terminal, as though the truth itself might draw stares. Then she said softly, "They made me leave first class. David, they said I didn't belong. They questioned me, mocked me, gave me a sandwich while everyone else ate dinner. They humiliated me." There was a pause on the line, a silence so heavy she could almost hear the storm building in his chest. When he spoke again, his voice was low, controlled, but edged with fire. Who did this? David know Mom?" Who? Clara's eyes burned. She pressed a hand to her bracelet, as though it could ground her. The lead attendant, a man named Brian, a young woman named Sophie, though she looked like she wanted to help, but no one stopped it. David, not one person. David's breath came hard through the phone, each inhale sharp, each exhale like thunder held back. "You shouldn't have gone through that," he said finally. His voice trembled now, not with weakness, but with rage and grief twisted together. "You shouldn't have had to endure that." "I've endured worse," Clara whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "But this felt different. Maybe because you gave me that ticket. You wanted me to feel honored. Instead, they tried to strip that away." There was silence again, heavier this time. Then David's voice returned, steady but fierce. "They don't know who they were dealing with. They don't know you are my mother. and they don't know that Aurora Airways is not just an airline, it is mine. I will not let this stand." Clara's chest tightened. She had known this was coming. She heard the storm she had feared and hoped for in his words. "David, listen to me," she said firmly. "Don't let anger guide you. Don't just punish them because of me. This isn't about revenge. It's about something bigger." "Do you understand?" David inhaled sharply. "Mom, they dragged you out of first class. They mocked you. They humiliated you in front of everyone. How do I not take that personally, because it isn't just me?" Clara answered softly. "If you fire them and move on, what changes? Nothing. But if you expose what happened, not just tonight, but every time something like this happens, you can change the system. That is what matters. Not revenge, justice." David's voice was quiet now, but beneath it lay the power of a man who had built his life on breaking barriers. "You're asking me to be patient when every part of me wants to burn it down." Clara's lips trembled into a faint smile. "I'm asking you to be my son, the man who fights for more than himself." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then David exhaled, his breath steadying. "All right, Mom, I'll do this the right way, but I promise you, they will answer for what they did." Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, though her heart felt lighter. "That's all I ask." When she hung up, she sat quietly in the terminal, the hum of the airport fading into the background. She knew the storm was coming now, not in her own hands, but in David's. She prayed it would not only bring justice for her, but change for all who had ever been told they did not belong. The morning light over Washington, D.C. spilled into David Johnson's office, but there was no warmth in it for him. He had been awake most of the night, pacing the length of the tall windows, staring out at the city he helped shape, the company he had built, and the dream that his mother had inspired. But the dream was tarnished now, and every thought of Clara sitting alone in economy, stripped of her dignity, lit another fire in his chest. By sunrise, David had already summoned his executive team for an emergency meeting. He sat at the head of the long oak conference table, his suit immaculate, but his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with determination. Around him, senior managers shuffled nervously, sensing this was no ordinary briefing. The air in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. David began without pleasantries. Last night, on an Aurora Airways flight from Chicago to Washington, a passenger was humiliated, degraded, and forced out of first class because of the color of her skin. His voice was low but sharp, each word deliberate. "That passenger was my mother." Gasps rippled through the room. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes. They had all read the initial incident report filed blandly as a seat verification misunderstanding. None had expected it to be connected so closely to the man leading the meeting. David let the silence hang for a beat before continuing. "But this is not about me. This is not about my mother alone. This is about every single person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has been treated as less than because of prejudice disguised as procedure." He lifted a file from the table, thick with papers Clara had compiled overnight. "These are records of similar complaints over the past year, almost all minimized, dismissed, or buried as clerical errors. This isn't an isolated mistake. It's a pattern." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked shocked, others seemed defensive, their lips tight, as though bracing for blame. David's voice cut through their discomfort. "We built Aurora Airways to stand for something more than profit. We promised dignity, equality, respect. But we've failed, and now the world will know unless we change not tomorrow, not next year, but now." The weight of his words settled over the room. A senior director, Mr. Harris, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think the situation is as severe as you're presenting. Surely, this is just a matter of a few employees exercising poor judgment." David's palm slammed against the table, startling everyone. His control rarely snapped, but tonight's fury bled through. "Do not minimize this. Do not stand here and tell me this is about a few employees. My mother was forced from her seat because she didn't look like she belonged. Do you understand how deep that cuts to her, to me, to every black passenger who has ever been second-guessed? This is not poor judgment. This is systemic." Harris shrank back, his cheeks flushing red. The rest of the room stayed silent, the truth hanging heavy in the air. David leaned forward, his voice lowering again but no less intense. "I will not allow Aurora Airways to become a symbol of hypocrisy. If we say we value people, then we must prove it. Starting today, this company is changing." Before anyone could respond, the doors at the far end of the conference room opened quietly. Clara stepped inside. She wore the same simple clothes from the flight, her tracksuit neat but unpretentious. She carried no designer bag, no entourage, only her quiet dignity. Yet, the moment she entered, the atmosphere shifted. Executives straightened in their chairs, whispers died mid-breath, and every eye turned toward her. David rose immediately, his expression softening for the first time that morning. He walked to her side, offered his arm, and guided her to the center of the room. "This is my mother, Clara Johnson," he announced, his voice filled with pride. "The woman whose strength built the foundation of everything I stand for, and the woman our employees treated like she was nothing." Clara's gaze swept across the faces in the room. She was not angry, not loud, but the weight of her silence was more powerful than any shout. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, calm, and deeply human. "I am not here to shame anyone. I am here because what happened to me has happened to too many others, and most of them never get a chance to sit in a room like this and speak their truth." Her words were simple, but the effect was profound. Executives who had entered defensive now sat frozen, some swallowing hard, others unable to meet her eyes. Clara continued, her voice gaining quiet strength. "When I boarded that plane, I carried with me only a boarding pass and the memory of my late husband, who always told me that dignity is not given, it is lived. Yet in that cabin, I was told my dignity didn't matter, not because of rules, not because of mistakes, but because of who I am and how I look." A young manager at the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glistening. Clara saw it but pressed on. "You can fire the crew, yes, you can punish individuals, but until you change the culture that allowed them to believe their behavior was acceptable, nothing will change." David watched his mother, his chest tightening with both sorrow and pride. He knew every word she spoke was not just for herself, but for all the silenced voices she carried with her. Clara placed the file of documents on the table, sliding it toward the executives. "These are not numbers. They are people. People who paid for a seat, who paid for dignity, and were denied both. If Aurora Airways is to mean anything, it must mean that no one, no matter how they look or dress, will ever be told again, 'You don't belong.'" The silence that followed was unlike before. It was not defensive now, but reflective, heavy with shame and realization. Some executives shifted, their shoulders sinking as though the truth had finally pierced them. David stepped forward, picking up where his mother left off. This is not just about an apology. This is about transformation, starting immediately. Every single employee of Aurora Airways will undergo comprehensive training on bias, respect, and cultural awareness. This will not be a box to check. This will be the foundation of our work. He turned to the head of Human Resources. All evaluation metrics will change. Respect for passengers will weigh as heavily as technical performance. Discrimination, explicit or implicit, will be grounds for termination. His gaze shifted to the corner where Margaret, Brian, and Sophie now sat brought in late, unaware of what awaited them. Margaret's usual polished confidence cracked, her face pale. Brian looked defiant at first, but sweat beaded at his temple. Sophie's eyes were wide, guilt and relief mingling as if she had long awaited this reckoning. David's voice dropped into something colder, sharper. As for the crew involved in this incident, you are not dismissed. Not yet. Instead, you will serve the next 3 months exclusively in economy, working under supervision. You will confront the very people you dismissed, ignored, or looked down on. You will learn respect not from training slides but from lived experience. Margaret's lips parted, as if to argue, but the words died in her throat. Brian shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. Sophie lowered her head, tears brimming at the edges of her eyes. Clara looked at them, her gaze soft but unwavering. This is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to teach you. I pray you find in it the lesson you denied me that night, the lesson of empathy. The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. The storm had broken, not with rage alone, but with truth, and everyone present knew there would be no returning to the way things were. News traveled faster than even David Johnson had anticipated. By the afternoon, following Clara's quiet but devastating testimony in the boardroom, the story had already escaped the confines of Aurora Airways headquarters and spread across the city. A leaked memo from an anonymous staffer, coupled with whispers from passengers who had witnessed the flight, began to build momentum online. On social media, hashtags erupted, "Here she belongs," Aurora Accountability, and, most prominently, Seat 3A. People shared their own stories. Black travelers, immigrants, women in business suits, men in work uniforms all recalling moments when they had been doubted, questioned, or humiliated for daring to sit where others thought they didn't belong. Clara's ordeal became a mirror in which thousands recognized their own scars. In the Johnson household, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her cup of tea cooling beside her. She wasn't on Twitter or Facebook. She never had much interest in screens. But she saw the ripple effect in the calls and messages flooding David's phone, in the journalists already camping outside the building, in the way neighbors knocked on the door not just to offer sympathy but to say, "Thank you. You spoke for us." David entered the kitchen. His tie loosened, his eyes tired but alight with determination. "Mom," he said, placing his phone on the table. "You've started something bigger than even I imagined." Clara raised her brow gently. "I didn't start it. Son, I only lived it. Others are speaking because they've lived it too." She stirred her tea, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. But now the question is, will they be heard? Or will their voices fade once the news cycle moves on? David sat opposite her, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. "That's why we can't let it fade. We need to capture this moment. Channel it. Aurora Airways has to be more than an airline, it has to be a symbol. If we can change here, it can ripple across the entire industry." Clara studied him for a long moment. His words carried the fire of ambition, the same fire she'd seen in him as a boy bent over his books, but she also heard the danger of pride, of moving too quickly. Be careful. David, change built on fury alone burns out. Change built on truth endures. He nodded slowly, taking her words in as he always did. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret and Brian sat in a small HR office, stripped of their crisp uniforms and forced into plain clothes for their reassignment. Brian paced the room angrily, his voice rising. This is ridiculous. Months in economy, like we're criminals all because of some old woman. Stop. Margaret cut in sharply. Her own pride was wounded, her face pale from the glare of cameras outside the airport when their names began circulating. Don't call her that. She's not just some old woman. She's the CEO's mother, and she carried herself like someone who couldn't be broken. Margaret sank into a chair, her voice low. I don't know if I've ever felt so small in my life, Brian scoffed. Small. She embarrassed us. She turned this into a spectacle. Everyone's against us now. Margaret shook her head. No, she didn't embarrass us. We embarrassed ourselves. Across the room, Sophie sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since the disciplinary hearing. But now, her voice broke through, trembling but clear. I could have stopped it. I could have said something, but I didn't. And now, everyone knows I didn't. Margaret looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability. For the first time, a flicker of guilt cracked her own defensiveness. Brian only rolled his eyes and turned away. Back at Aurora's headquarters, David convened a press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the podium, and journalists leaned forward, eager for his statement. He stood tall, his voice steady, his message simple. What happened to my mother is unacceptable. But this is not about one person, one crew, or one flight. This is about every passenger who has been treated with less than the respect they deserve. Aurora Airways will not hide from this. We will lead the industry into change. He laid out the reforms, mandatory training, structural shifts in evaluation, direct accountability channels for passengers. But what captured the world's attention was not the policy it was when Clara stepped forward beside him. She did not speak long, but her presence was enough. This is not just my story, she said softly into the microphone. It is the story of many. If you have ever been told you don't belong, know this you do, and your dignity is not theirs to give or take. The room erupted with applause. The clip spread instantly, replayed on evening news, shared across social media. People who had never heard of Clara Johnson now spoke her name as though she were family. That evening, David returned home, his shoulders heavy but his spirit burning. He found Clara in her armchair, knitting quietly, the television muted. You realize, he said with a faint smile, they're calling you the voice of my seat 3A now. Clara chuckled softly. I didn't ask for that. I only asked for a seat. Yes, David said, his smile fading into something more solemn. But your seat has become everyone's seat. For a while, they sat in silence, the kind that felt full rather than empty. Clara's hands moved steadily with the knitting needles, while David stared into the middle distance, already thinking of the work ahead. Somewhere across the city, Margaret lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Clara had spoken in the boardroom. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar shame that cut deeper than fear of losing her job. Brian, in contrast, ranted on the phone to anyone who would listen, but his words rang hollow, even to himself. Sophie, sitting alone in her own tiny kitchen, whispered into the quiet, I'm sorry. The ripple had begun, and Clara knew. as she folded her knitting and set it aside, that this was only the beginning of something far larger than her. The seat she lost had opened a door for thousands to claim their place. The days that followed were unlike anything Clara Johnson had experienced in her long life. What began as a humiliating flight had transformed into a movement. The story of Seat 3A was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every person who had carried the sting of being told they didn't belong. Television anchors replayed her calm words at the press conference, marveling at the poise of a woman who never raised her voice, yet commanded a room. Newspapers carried headlines that read Aurora CEO's Mother Sparks Industry Reckoning and Seat 3A the Symbol of Dignity. Talk shows invited civil rights leaders, cultural critics, and ordinary travelers to share their own stories. Clara's quiet defiance had lit a flame, and the world was feeding it. Inside Aurora Airways headquarters, David Johnson worked day and night, balancing the demands of leadership with the personal weight of being a son. He fielded interviews, drafted reforms, and built partnerships with advocacy groups. He knew the company's survival depended not on burying the scandal, but on transforming it into a turning point. Yet, beneath the spotlight, Clara remained the center. Letters arrived at the Johnson home, some handwritten, others printed emails that David's staff forwarded to her. She read stories of men turned away from hotel lobbies, women ignored in first-class cabins, families asked to prove their tickets twice. Some letters came from children who wrote, "My grandma went through the same thing, and she never spoke about it until now." Clara read them all, her hands trembling, her heart heavy but also strangely lifted. One evening, as she sat on the porch with David, she handed him a letter written in careful cursive. "This one," she said softly, "reminds me of myself." David read aloud, "Dear Mrs. Johnson, I'm 72 years old. I thought I'd grown used to swallowing my pride, but when I saw you refuse that sandwich, I remembered the little girl I used to be, the one who wanted to sit at the front of the bus but was told to move. You gave her back her courage. Thank you." His voice caught as he finished. Clara placed her hand gently over his. "You see, son, this is bigger than us, bigger than Aurora. This is about the silent ones finally finding words." Meanwhile, the airline industry was watching closely. Competitors scrambled to distance themselves, issuing statements about their own commitment to inclusivity. Some launched hasty reviews of their customer service practices, but activists weren't impressed. They pointed to Aurora, not as a cautionary tale, but as the first airline to confront the issue head-on. The Federal Transportation Board announced an inquiry, citing Clara's case as evidence of systemic discrimination in air travel. Lawmakers began drafting proposals for stricter accountability standards. Journalists called it the Aurora effect, but not everyone welcomed the change. A vocal minority of critics argued that the story was being exaggerated, that Clara had received special treatment because of her son's position. Online threads buzzed with debate. Clara read none of it, but David did, his jaw tightening each time. "They want to twist it. Mom," he said one night, pacing the living room, "they want to make it look like this is about privilege when it's about the opposite." Clara touched his arm gently. "Let them argue. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It stands on its own, far from the Johnson home." Margaret faced her own storm. Each day in economy was a lesson in humility she had not asked for but could not escape. Passengers were less forgiving there. They complained openly, demanded assistance without the soft filters of wealth or status. For the first time, Margaret found herself without the shield of prestige, standing eye to eye with the very people she had once dismissed. Late one evening, after a grueling shift, She sat alone in the break room, her hands covering her face. Sophie entered quietly, her steps hesitant. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sophie said softly, "Do you think we deserved this?" Margaret lowered her hands, her face lined with exhaustion. "I don't know about you, but me, yes, I do." Her voice cracked on the last word. Sophie sat beside her, silent. They both knew that something in them had shifted, though neither could name it fully yet. Brian, however, remained defiant. He ranted about unfair punishment, rolled his eyes at passengers' complaints, and mocked the reforms spreading through the company. But even he couldn't ignore the change in the air. Passengers whispered his name, pointing him out as the one from the Waldron Seat 3A flight. The scrutiny followed him everywhere, and though he hid it behind bravado, it gnawed at him in ways he wouldn't admit. For Clara, the weeks unfolded like waves. Each new interview, each new letter, each new story shared in her name made her feel both burdened and blessed. She never wanted to be a symbol, yet she could not turn away from those who saw hope in her defiance. One night, she sat at her kitchen table with David. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Son," she said softly, "I keep thinking of all the times I stayed silent, times when your father and I were told to move, to wait, to settle. I thought silence was strength then, but now I wonder if I was wrong." David looked at her, his eyes softening. "You weren't wrong, Mom. Silence kept you safe. Silence raised me, but now it's different. Your voice is safe because others are listening, and you're giving theirs permission to rise." Clara sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. "It's a heavy gift, David. I only pray I carry it well." "You are," he said firmly. "You always have." The next day, Aurora Airways announced a partnership with several civil rights organizations to create a passenger advocacy council. Clara was asked to serve as its honorary chair. At first, she resisted, insisting she was not a politician or a leader. But David reminded her gently, "You've been a leader all your life, just not in the way the world usually measures." She accepted, though with humility, and when she stood before the cameras once again, announcing the council, her words carried the weight of someone who had lived the struggle, not just studied it. "This isn't about me," she told the world. "It's about every seat that should never be taken away again." The ripple had become a tide, and though Clara still woke some mornings with the ache of memory, she also woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The council Clara Johnson had reluctantly agreed to chair quickly became the beating heart of the reforms at Aurora Airways. What began as a symbolic gesture transformed into a real engine for change. Meetings were packed with advocates, lawyers, and passengers whose stories mirrored her own. Clara often sat quietly at the head of the table, listening more than she spoke. But when she did speak, her words carried a moral authority that no executive in the room could match. David watched with quiet awe. He had always known his mother was strong, but seeing her command rooms filled with leaders and policymakers reminded him of the late nights at their kitchen table when she taught him history, courage, and dignity. Now, she was teaching the world. Yet, as the movement grew, so did the backlash. Newspapers ran op-eds claiming Aurora was bending too far, pandering to activists. Pundits on talk shows dismissed Clara as an overprotected CEO's mother who got special treatment. Online, critics mocked the reforms, posting comments like, "First-class seats are for paying customers, not pity projects." David read them, fury burning in his chest, but Clara remained calm. "Let them talk," she told him one evening as they shared a meal at home. Every movement meets resistance. The question is not what they say, it's what we choose to do anyway. Her calm only sharpened David's resolve. Meanwhile, in the training rooms of Aurora Airways, the real reckoning was unfolding. Margaret, once proud and immovable, sat in a row of attendants undergoing cultural sensitivity workshops. She had dreaded the humiliation of it. But as she listened to passengers share their experiences, something in her shifted. She realized that for years she had lived in a bubble of privilege, enforcing rules not out of fairness but out of her own bias. For the first time, she felt the sting of recognition, an admission that maybe Clara had been right. Sophie, sitting 2 seats away, scribbled furiously in her notebook. She wasn't just taking notes for the training. She was writing down her own promise to herself. Never again. She wrote, "Never again will I stay silent." Brian, however, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, rolling his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "We're flight attendants, not social workers. People are too sensitive these days." His defiance grew louder as the weeks went on, and whispers spread that his future at Aurora was dimming quickly. Clara, though she never attended the sessions herself, heard updates through the council. She prayed quietly each night for the crew, not for their downfall, but for their change. "Lord," she whispered, "open their eyes. Let them see the dignity they tried to deny." One afternoon, weeks after the council had launched, Clara was invited to speak at a national aviation summit. The ballroom was filled with executives from airlines across the country, lawmakers, and reporters. She stepped up to the podium slowly, leaning slightly on her cane, but her voice carried with unwavering strength. "I am not a politician. I am not a business leader. I am simply a woman who bought a ticket, sat in a seat, and was told she didn't belong." She began. "What happened to me was not unique. That is the tragedy. But the fact that we are gathered here today to face it, that is the hope." Her words brought the room to a hush. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, but many nodded, recognizing the truth they could no longer deny. Clara finished with a plea that resonated far beyond the walls of the summit. Do not let dignity be a luxury. Let it be the standard. The next morning, headlines declared, "Clara Johnson becomes the moral compass of aviation." Airlines across the nation announced they would adopt reforms similar to Aurora's. The ripple had become a wave, but change always brought conflict. At Aurora headquarters, David faced mounting pressure from shareholders worried about costs, from critics claiming the company was losing focus, and from employees struggling to adapt. Late one evening, he sat in his office, head in his hands, when Clara walked in quietly. "You're carrying too much," she said softly. David looked up, exhaustion etched across his face. "I don't know if I can hold it all. Mom, the reforms, the criticism, the board breathing down my neck. Some days I wonder if I made the wrong choice." Clara walked over, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "The right choice is rarely the easy one. But, son, you are not carrying this alone. Every person who has spoken out, every passenger who writes their story, every worker who changes their heart, they are carrying it too. Trust them. Trust that you've planted seeds you may not live to see bloom." Her words steadied him for a moment. He wasn't the CEO under siege. He was her son again. The boy who had once needed her encouragement at the kitchen table. Meanwhile, Margaret's transformation deepened. One evening, after a long day in economy, she sat in her apartment and picked up her phone. With trembling fingers, she dialed Clara's number. When Clara answered, Margaret's voice cracked. "Mrs. Johnson," she said softly. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to tell you I was wrong, not just that night, but for years. I treated people like they were beneath me, and I thought it was just doing my job, but it wasn't the job. It was my pride, and I am sorry." Clara listened quietly, her heart swelling with both sorrow and grace. "Margaret," she said gently, "forgiveness is not mine to give alone. It is yours to seek every day from the people you serve. But I will tell you this, you have taken the first step, and that matters." Margaret wept softly into the phone. For the first time, Clara believed she might truly change. Brian, however, doubled down on his bitterness. When disciplinary hearings finally came, he sneered through the proceedings, blaming political correctness for his downfall. Within weeks, Aurora terminated his employment. The news barely made headlines, overshadowed by the sweeping reforms Clara and David had championed. For Clara, the personal journey was far from over. Though celebrated as a symbol, she remained humble, often retreating to her porch in the evenings with her knitting and her prayers. She thought often of her late husband, imagining what he would say if he saw her now. "You were always the strong one," she whispered into the quiet night, and deep within, she knew the reckoning was not just for the airline or the industry. It was for the nation itself a reckoning with silence, with prejudice, with the choice between comfort and courage. Winter settled over Washington, D.C., and with it came a slower rhythm to the whirlwind that had overtaken the Johnson family. Snow dusted the streets outside Clara's home, and from her porch she could see children dragging sleds down the sidewalks, their laughter carrying across the crisp air. It reminded her of her own childhood winters, long before airplanes and hashtags, when dignity was something her parents told her she would need to fight for every day. Clara sat inside by the fire, knitting steadily. The flames crackled softly, but her mind wandered to the faces she had seen in recent weeks, passengers in tears as they recounted their humiliations, executives squirming under her calm words, strangers stopping her in grocery stores just to whisper thank you. She had become, unwillingly, a vessel for the pain of many, and though it was heavy, she bore it because she knew the silence of the past had been heavier still. David entered the room with a folder under his arm, his steps purposeful but weary. He dropped the folder on the table beside her, knitting. "Mom, I wanted you to see this." Clara set her needles aside and opened the folder. Inside were pages of reports, graphs, testimonies, financial forecasts, but one section caught her eye. Passenger satisfaction up 37% since reforms began. She looked at David, her brow lifting gently. "That's something." He nodded. "It's more than something. It's proof we're on the right path, but it's also costing us. Some investors are threatening to pull out. They say the training and cultural programs are wasteful." His voice dripped with frustration. "They don't see the bigger picture." Clara touched his hand lightly. "They rarely do at first. You can't measure dignity in dollars, son, but you can measure the cost of losing it." David sighed, leaning back. "I know, but sometimes I feel like I'm fighting two battles, one for justice and one for survival." "You are," Clara said softly, "but you're not fighting alone." Across town, Margaret sat at a diner, her coffee cooling as she stared out the window. She was off duty, but her mind was restless. For weeks, she had served in economy, carrying bags, listening to complaints, smiling at passengers who barely looked at her. At first, she had resented it. Now, she was learning. A young mother with 2 children had thanked her profusely for helping with luggage. An elderly man had taken her hand and said, "Thank you for treating me like I matter." Each small moment chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. Sophie slid into the booth across from her, unannounced but welcome. She carried her own coffee, her eyes brighter than Margaret had seen in months. "You've changed," Sophie said softly. Margaret gave a half-smile, weary but genuine. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing what was always there." She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "Clara Johnson. She's been in my head every day since that flight. Not her anger. She never raised her voice, but her steadiness. I keep asking myself if I could have stood like that, and the answer scares me." Sophie nodded, her gaze lowering. "I wasn't steady. I was silent." Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand lightly on Sophie's. "We were both silent, in different ways. But maybe it's not too late to find our voices." Their conversation lingered, two women reshaping themselves in the shadow of a woman they had once tried to diminish. Meanwhile, Brian raged. Termination had not humbled him, it had embittered him further. He appeared on small podcasts and fringe news shows, railing against cancel culture and painting himself as the victim. His words found a small but eager audience online, stoking division. But the world was moving on without him, and the bitterness in his tone only revealed how hollow his fight truly was. For Clara, healing came slowly. Some nights, she still dreamed of the humiliation, Margaret's clipped tone, Brian's smirk, the eyes of silent passengers watching as she was forced to move. She would wake with her chest tight, gripping her bracelet until the memory faded. But healing also came in new forms. Children wrote her letters for school projects, calling her Grandma Clara. Civil rights groups invited her to speak. Church choirs sang in her honor. She accepted the gestures with humility, never letting the attention distract her from the core truth: she was just one woman who had refused to move. At one council meeting, a young man stood up, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Mrs. Johnson, when I saw you on the news, I thought of my own mother. She never fought back when they treated her badly. She just swallowed it. But because of you, I told her story for the first time. And she cried, because she realized her silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. But now she knows her voice matters too." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she reached for his hand. "Your mother is brave. Don't ever doubt that. And now, you're brave too, for speaking it out loud." David watched the exchange, his chest tightening with pride. This was what he had hoped for, not just reform, but resonance, not just policy, but people finding strength through his mother's example. Yet, the division in the country reminded them that progress was never universal. While many embraced the reforms, others clung to resentment. David received anonymous threats, Clara's mailbox filled with both gratitude and hate. She read the hateful letters once, then burned them in the fireplace. "I've carried heavier words before," she told David calmly. He wanted to protect her from it, but she refused to be shielded. "If I hide from their words, they win," she said firmly. "And I've spent my life being told to move aside. I will not move now." One Sunday, after church, Clara walked slowly down the steps with David at her side. A stranger approached a middle-aged white woman, her hands trembling. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice cracking. "I was on that flight. I sat in first class. I stayed silent. I should have spoken." Clara looked at her for a long moment, the memory of that night flashing in her mind. The shame in the woman's eyes was unmistakable. Clara reached out, taking her hand gently. "It's never too late to find your voice," she said. The woman wept, clutching Clara's hand. David watched, realizing again that his mother's strength lay not in anger, but in grace. She was able to turn guilt into growth, silence into sound. At home that evening, Clara sat in her armchair, her knitting in her lap. She looked at David and smiled softly. "You know, son, I think your father would laugh at all this. He'd say, 'Clara, you always had a way of making noise without raising your voice.'" David chuckled, though his eyes glistened. He'd be proud. Mom. More than proud. Clara gazed at the fire, her heart both heavy and light. She had not asked for this fight, but it had found her, and she had carried it as best she could. Healing was slow, division remained, but hope was alive, and in that hope she saw the beginning of a better future. Spring arrived in Washington, D.C., with blossoms lining the streets, but for Clara Johnson, the season brought more than flowers. It brought invitations, phone calls, and unexpected visits from people she had never met: pilots, teachers, nurses, and even high school students. Each one came with a story, and each story seemed to echo her own in some way. One morning, Clara sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a young man in his 20s holding a worn leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Marcus, a law student at Howard University. His voice shook as he spoke. "Mrs. Johnson, I wrote a paper about you, about what happened on Flight 601. My professor said I should deliver it to you myself." Clara welcomed him in, offering tea. As he opened his briefcase and handed her the paper, she noticed the title, "Unseen Until They Stand: The Quiet Power of Resistance." Clara smiled softly. "That's quite a title." Marcus flushed. "I wanted people to see that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits calmly in seat 2A and refuses to be moved." Clara read the first few lines, her eyes misting. She had never thought of herself as an example for anyone. Yet here was a young man shaping his future on her story. She looked at him with warmth. "Thank you. Marcus, your words will carry further than you know." Meanwhile, David found himself invited to international conferences. Aurora Airways had become the face of reform in aviation, and though David often felt the pressure of being scrutinized, he leaned on his mother's example. In New York, at a gathering of industry leaders, he stood before a packed room. Screens displayed his company's reforms, from mandatory bias training to transparent passenger complaint systems. David's voice rang clear. "We once thought safety meant keeping order in the cabin. Now we know safety also means dignity. A passenger stripped of respect is a passenger who has been harmed. Aurora Airways will not stand for that harm any longer." Applause filled the hall, but what struck David most was the sight of CEOs from rival airlines taking notes. Later that evening, one of them approached him quietly. "Your mother's courage," the man admitted, "has made us look at ourselves in ways we never dared. I may not like admitting it, but she's forced us to confront what we've ignored for decades." Back in Chicago, Margaret continued her service in economy. She had begun keeping a journal, each entry a reflection on what she learned daily. One passage read, "A passenger asked me today why I seemed so careful with their tray. I realized it was because I had once been careless with dignity, and careless with respect. That carelessness cost me more than I could ever repay." Sophie, too, had changed. She volunteered for community outreach, speaking with high school students about the dangers of silence. "I didn't shout racial slurs," she told them. "I didn't throw anyone out of their seat. I just didn't speak up. And silence can wound just as deeply." The students listened, their faces sober, some nodding with the recognition of their own silent moments. Brian, however, spiraled further. His bitterness made him a frequent guest on late-night talk shows that thrived on outrage. He mocked Clara by name, insisting she had exaggerated the humiliation. But each time he spoke, public sympathy tilted further away from him. Sponsors cut ties, and eventually even the shows stopped inviting him. Alone in his small apartment, Brian scrolled through hateful messages from the strangers who once supported him. His arrogance had left him isolated, his voice drowned by the growing chorus calling for change. Clara did not watch his appearances. Anger only multiplies if you feed it, she told David. Instead, she chose to attend church meetings and community forums where ordinary people shared how her story had emboldened them. At one forum, a teacher said, "When my student was mocked for her hair, I thought of you, Mrs. Johnson. I stood beside her instead of brushing it off. That moment changed both of us." Clara smiled, humbled. Then all of this pain has not been in vain. One evening, David invited Clara to attend a special ceremony at Aurora's headquarters. The lobby buzzed with employees, reporters, and community leaders. On the stage hung a new banner, Aurora Airways Dignity in the Skies. As Clara was escorted to the front, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many employees had never met her in person. David stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor the person whose quiet strength forced us to change. Not a board member, not a politician, but my mother, Clara Johnson." The room erupted in applause. Clara rose slowly, her bracelet catching the light as she walked. She stood before the microphone, the weight of countless eyes upon her, and spoke softly but firmly. "I am no hero. I am a mother, a widow, a woman who simply wanted to sit in the seat she had paid for. What happened to me was not unique. It happens every day in ways big and small. But if my story has opened your eyes, then let it also open your hearts, because policies and training mean little without compassion." The room fell silent, every word sinking deep. Clara continued, "I do not want revenge. I want reflection. I do not want punishment. I want progress, and I believe each of you can carry that forward. Not because your company tells you to, but because your conscience does." When she stepped down, tears glistened in the eyes of many employees. Even hardened executives wiped at their faces discreetly. David hugged her tightly, whispering, "You've done more tonight than I could ever do in a lifetime." The ripple of her words spread beyond the walls of Aurora. Within weeks, other airlines launched similar initiatives. Newspapers ran headlines like "From Humiliation to Hope, the Woman Who Changed Aviation." Clara's face, once just another in the crowd, now appeared on magazine covers and advocacy campaigns. Still, she remained grounded. "I don't want fame," she told her pastor. "I want fairness." At home, she tended her garden, watered her roses, and sat on her porch as neighborhood children played. Yet she knew the ripples were still moving outward. A letter arrived one morning from a flight attendant at another airline. "I once treated a passenger the way Margaret treated you. I've carried that shame for years. Your story gave me the courage to confess and change. Thank you." Clara folded the letter and placed it beside Marcus's paper. She'd begun collecting these tokens of change, storing them in a small wooden box. She called it her box of voices. Late one night, as she added another letter, David stopped by after a long day. "Mom, why do you keep them all?" Clara smiled faintly. "Because one day, when I'm gone, I want you to remember that change doesn't come from titles or money. It comes from ordinary voices refusing to stay silent." David sat beside her, placing his hand over hers. and your voice was the first. Clara shook her head gently. No, son. Mine was just the echo of all the voices that were silenced before me. I only made sure it was finally heard. The ripple continued, unseen but unstoppable, spreading across skies and hearts alike. Summer swept into Washington, D.C., thick with heat and restless energy. Aurora Airways had just announced its most ambitious plan, yet a scholarship program for underrepresented youth to pursue careers in aviation and aerospace. The program was set to launch at a national education summit, with Clara Johnson invited as guest of honor. Clara sat in her living room the evening before the summit, the soft hum of cicadas floating through the open window. Her bracelet glinted faintly in the lamplight as she turned it around her wrist, lost in thought. She had faced reporters, boards, and entire auditoriums, but the idea of speaking before thousands of young people made her chest tighten. These were the very faces of the future, and she feared letting them down. David entered quietly, sensing her unease. You've faced harsher rooms than this. Mom. Remember the board meeting. The silence you broke. Clara smiled faintly. Yes, but that was a room of people who needed waking up. Tomorrow will be a room full of people already awake. What if I can't give them enough hope to keep them standing? David knelt beside her chair, his hand resting over hers. Mom, you don't have to carry all the hope. You just have to light it. They'll carry the rest. The next day. The convention center pulsed with anticipation. Banners stretched across the lobby, Aurora Scholarship opening the skies to everyone. Young men and women filled the seats, many clutching notebooks, their faces a mix of nerves and excitement. David delivered the opening remarks, his voice steady but full of emotion. We once thought change meant rewriting policy, but real change means rewriting possibility. Today, we begin building pathways for those who've been told the sky wasn't theirs to touch. When Clara took the stage, the crowd rose in applause. She walked slowly to the microphone, scanning the sea of young faces, each one reflecting a story not yet told. I am here today, not because I wanted to be. She began softly. I am here because I refuse to be moved from my seat. That refusal became a story, and that story brought me here. But I want you to know my story is just one of many. Each of you carries one too. The silence in the room was thick, the kind of silence that leaned forward, waiting. Clara continued. Some of you have been told no before you even asked. Some of you have been doubted simply for how you look, where you come from, or what your name sounds like. But listen to me, your worth is not up for negotiation. The seat you earn, the dream you build, is yours. A young girl in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. Clara noticed but pressed on, her voice steady. This scholarship is not a gift. It is a bridge you will walk across with your own strength. Aurora is not giving you wings, you already have them. We're simply opening the sky. The room erupted in applause, some students standing, others clapping with trembling hands. David felt his throat tighten as he watched his mother step back, her presence filling the space without a single raised note of anger. She had lit the fire, and it burned brightly. But not everyone celebrated. Outside the summit, protesters gathered, holding signs that read merit, not handouts, and stop playing identity politics. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras capturing the division. Later that evening, David sat in his office, staring at the television as pundits debated Aurora's program. It's just pandering. One scoffed, scholarship should be about achievement, not skin color. Another countered, But isn't opportunity part of achievement? If you never get a chance, how do you prove yourself? David muted the screen, his jaw tightening. Clara entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one in front of him. Don't let the noise drown out the truth. They're saying it's politics, David muttered. Clara sat across from him, her gaze calm. Of course they are. Progress always sounds like politics to those who fear losing their privilege. But listen carefully. Son, it isn't politics to feed the hungry. It isn't politics to lift the fallen. And it isn't politics to open doors that should never have been closed. David exhaled, her words cutting through his frustration. Sometimes I wonder if we're moving too fast. Clara leaned forward. Justice is never fast. What feels fast to them is late to us. In Chicago, Margaret followed the summit coverage on her phone during her break. She watched Clara's speech twice, both times with tears streaming down her face. She closed her journal and wrote a single line. Her dignity became my mirror. That evening, she emailed Aurora's HR department, requesting to join the company's new diversity council. I need to be part of building the culture I once damaged, she typed. It was the first time she had used the word need instead of want. Sophie, too, had been watching. She had begun mentoring young recruits at the airline, telling them her story honestly. Don't make my mistake, she told them. Silence may feel safe, but it leaves scars you'll carry longer than you expect. Her vulnerability surprised her colleagues, but it also drew them closer. Even Brian, bitter and marginalized, saw the summit news on his phone. He scoffed loudly, tossing it aside, but when the room went quiet, he stared at the ceiling, a pang of something unfamiliar tugging at him. Regret. He buried it quickly, telling himself it was weakness, yet, deep down, he knew it was the truth pressing in. The summit made national headlines. Newspapers featured Clara's words beside photos of cheering students. Commentators called it the turning point of Aurora's cultural revolution. Civil rights groups praised the initiative, while critics doubled down, fueling debates across dinner tables and social media feeds. For Clara, the noise mattered less than the quiet moments afterward. Letters poured in from students who dreamed of flying, engineers who longed to design, and parents who had never dared to believe their children could reach the skies. One letter, handwritten in shaky script, came from a grandmother in Alabama. I've never been on a plane in my life, but because of you, my granddaughter believes she can fly them. I don't know what that means for her future, but I know it means hope, and that's enough for me. Clara read the letter aloud to David, her voice trembling. He wiped his eyes, unable to hide his pride. Mom, do you realize what you've done? You've turned one painful moment into a movement. Clara shook her head gently. No, son. I've only reminded people of what should have been true all along. That dignity isn't optional. The summer air was thick as they sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Outside, fireflies blinked softly in the dark, tiny sparks of light moving steadily through the night, just like the change Clara had set in motion. Autumn leaves drifted across the streets of Chicago, painting the sidewalks with shades of gold and crimson. Clara Johnson sat on her porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She had returned for a short visit to the city where her ordeal began. The place where a single humiliating flight had unraveled into something far greater than she ever imagined. David insisted on accompanying her, though Clara smiled knowingly. You're afraid I'll stir up more trouble, aren't you? She teased. David chuckled, his eyes soft. Mom, You don't stir up trouble. Trouble finds you and then learns its lesson. They shared a laugh, but both knew this visit carried weight. Aurora Airways had arranged a ceremony at O'Hare International Airport, unveiling a new initiative, a permanent passenger advocacy office located in the very terminal where Clara had been escorted off her flight. For David, it was about institutionalizing reform. For Clara, it was about reclaiming the space where her dignity had been challenged. On the day of the ceremony, the terminal buzzed with reporters, employees, and travelers who paused to watch. Banners read Aurora Airways every seat, every voice. A small stage was set near the departure gates, where David stood with other executives. Clara was escorted to the podium amid applause. She looked out at the faces before her, some curious, some supportive, a few skeptical. Taking a steady breath, she began. "This place," she said, her voice low but firm, "was once the setting of my humiliation. Today, it becomes the setting of our healing. I was told I didn't belong here, but every person who passes through these doors belongs. No seat, no service, no space in this sky should ever be denied because of prejudice." She paused, letting her words settle. "This office will not erase what happened to me, but it will ensure that when dignity is challenged, there will be accountability. And that, I believe, is a beginning." The room erupted in applause, and Clara stepped back, her eyes shimmering with tears she would not let fall. After the ceremony, as she walked through the terminal with David, travelers stopped to thank her. A mother whispered, "Because of you, I don't fear flying with my children anymore." A young man clasped her hand, saying, "I'm training to be a pilot. You made me believe I belong in the cockpit." Each word lifted her heart, but also deepened her awareness of the responsibility she carried. This wasn't just about her story anymore, it was about all the stories that had been silenced. Later that evening, Clara and David visited a small cafe near the airport. It was quiet, the clinking of cups and low murmur of conversation filling the air. David leaned across the table, his expression thoughtful. "Mom, sometimes I wonder have we really changed the world, or just nudged it a little?" Clara smiled gently. "Change doesn't come in leaps. Son, it comes in steps. We've taken one. Others will take the next." She sipped her tea, then added, "The important thing is, we've shown that silence is not the only choice. Across town." Margaret prepared for her first official meeting as a member of Aurora's Diversity Council. She stood in front of her mirror, smoothing her uniform. The reflection staring back was not the same woman who once dismissed passengers with a cold glance. She carried the weight of shame, but also the seed of redemption. Tonight, she would face colleagues she once considered beneath her, and she would listen instead of command. Sophie, too, was moving forward. She had enrolled in evening classes, determined to study sociology and perhaps one day become an advocate for systemic change beyond the skies. Her nights were long, balancing work and study, but her heart was lighter. She often thought of Clara's steady presence as her compass. Brian, however, faded into obscurity. His name was no longer in headlines, his voice no longer amplified. He moved from one odd job to another, grumbling about what they took from me. But the world had moved on, uninterested in bitterness that clung to the past. For Clara, the journey had come full circle. She returned home to Washington, D.C., where the garden she tended bloomed late into the season. She sat on her porch with her knitting, her bracelet glinting in the fading light. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying into the evening. David joined her, settling into the chair beside her. "Mom, You know, the scholarship applications have doubled since the summit. We're seeing kids apply from places we never thought would reach us. Clara's eyes warmed. That's the real victory. Son, not applause, not headlines opportunity. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky darken, stars pricking through the velvet blue. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice soft but steady. Do you remember what your father used to say? He'd say, "The world will try to shrink you. Don't let it. Stretch wide, even if it scares them." David smiled faintly. You stretched wide, Mom, wider than you know. Clara's gaze lingered on the stars. I only held my seat. The rest was God's doing. As autumn deepened, Clara continued her quiet life. She still received letters, still spoke at events occasionally, but mostly she cherished the simple rhythm of her days. She had become, to many, a symbol of dignity. To David, she remained simply his mother, the woman who had raised him with stories, who had taught him to see dignity not as a prize, but as a birthright. One crisp evening, she opened the wooden box where she kept her voices, the letters, essays, and stories others had sent. She read a few, her heart swelling with gratitude. Then she closed the box gently and whispered, May these voices never fall silent again. The journey that began with humiliation had ended in hope. Clara Johnson had been told she didn't belong, but her refusal to accept that lie had lit a path for countless others. And though the fight for dignity was far from over, the circle of change had begun to widen, one voice at a time. Clara Johnson's story is more than an airline scandal. It is a reminder of the quiet strength that lives in each of us. At her age, she had endured a lifetime of being told to move aside, yet she chose dignity over silence, and in doing so, she inspired not only her son, but also countless strangers to find their voices. For older generations, this story carries a powerful truth. Your experiences are not behind you. They are the foundation of change. Clara didn't fight with anger, she stood with grace. That grace reached further than shouting ever could. Her calm defiance proved that it's never too late to spark transformation, and that even the most ordinary acts like holding onto your seat can ripple into extraordinary change. The lesson is simple, yet profound respect is not a privilege. It is a right, and when we stand for it, we give courage to others to do the same. Clara's story reminds us that our dignity is unshakable, no matter our age, no matter the circumstances. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If Clara's story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and hope to the world.